The Social Democrat Party has its roots in the teachings of Karl Marx, yet unlike the communists, it has chosen a reformist path to socialism. Ever since the first half of the 20th century, the party has dominated Swedish politics, usually with the help of the Communist Party if needed to form a majority government. Its goal has been to create a big enough government to care for everyone's needs, from the cradle to the grave, something called folkhemmet, the people's home in Swedish. To accomplish this goal of social engineering, it has utilized state power in a brutal way. The history of the Social Democrats includes incarcerating potential troublemakers in concentration camps like Storsien during World War II, forcibly sterilizing nearly 2% of the female population, during the 1950s and 60s taking nearly 5% of the country's children from their parents and putting them in state-run foster homes, and establishing forms of cooperation between the party, the trade unions, the employers' unions, big business and the military in a grand corporativistic scheme. It has employed more or less discreet brown shirt methods in its bid to control the country, often among its own ranks referring to free media as the enemy, an enemy that eventually succumbed to them as they extended state control over mass media.
Jag är uppvuxen med en annan bild av Peter Bratt. 73 var jag alltså 24 år och var stenhårt aktiv i SSU. Det här var fienden med stort F.
Perhaps its most faithful and useful servant in its control of society has been the conglomerate of most Swedish trade unions called Landsorganisationen, abbreviated LO. During most of the 20th century, joining the trade union meant you were forced to join the Social Democrat Party as well, and being part of the union was required for unemployment benefits. This wasn't very popular with its members, however, and eventually the forced membership was abandoned. After World War II had ended, communists had become a force to be reckoned with in Sweden, and this didn't bode well for the complete control over society that the Social Democrats desired. They started organizing political monitoring of workplaces, aiming to eliminate all competing trade union activity at them. Their representatives were called arbetsplatsombud in Swedish, and eventually they were to number 22,000. Party members whose job it was to secretly monitor the views people expressed and reporting on them to the party headquarters, as well as surveying the political climate for potential recruits. In 1945, communists had controlled 1/3 of the union members. 9 years later in 1954, they controlled less than 1%. The Social Democrats had also registered personal information such as drinking habits and personal problems of their enemies, and when the people in their files moved to a new workplace, they often found that the local arbetsplatsombud had already been briefed on their backgrounds, enabling the Social Democrat Party to effectively neutralize them. In 1953, an organization called IB was secretly formed, one that would coordinate efforts at political registration between the Social Democrat Party, the trade unions and the military, which feared Soviet infiltration in society. Olof Palme was alleged to have been one of the men behind the organization. They were able to enlist the aid of the arbetsplatsombud of the party, as well as telephone eavesdropping provided by the government. Details on the phone calls of monitored people were written down, and some people were monitored as security risks for over 10 years without anything suspicious ever surfacing. In 1964, roughly 220,000 people voted for the Communist Party, and at the same time over 100,000 communists were in the files. Hence it appears that the registration work IB was doing had captured roughly half the country's communists, in spite of the ballot being secret. On top of this, leading Social Democrats used the IB agency to spy on each other during their internal power struggles. Political registration was made illegal in 1969, Yet this ban had no effect since Sweden doesn't have a constitutional court that can put the government on trial. This secrecy would change in 1973, however, when journalists at the Swedish leftist magazine Folket Bild Kulturfront received information on the operation from a leak and published an article about it. The government would not take kindly to this publication. They denied any criminal activity had taken place, but charges were still raised against the agency, though they were dropped. For the journalists, on the other hand, prison sentences would be served. On the 22nd of October 1973, the police arrested the two journalists and their leak, and they were charged with indirect espionage by exposing information on how the operation was being run to the Soviets. On the 4th of January 1974, all three are sentenced to a year in prison. 3 decades later, in 2002, their claims were finally vindicated in a report delivered by a state commission. It turns out these 3 men had been put in prison for speaking the truth about what the Swedish state did against its own citizens. The Swedish government has also used the information learned from this surveillance to bar registered people from employment at certain positions. In the 1980s, over 400,000 job positions in the Swedish public sector had a protected status, meaning people with questionable political views weren't to be employed at them. This was out of 1.4 million government jobs, hence almost 30% of these jobs were off limits if the government didn't approve of your politics. Many people whose applications for these positions were rejected were neither informed for what reason they didn't get the job, nor that they were registered in the political files of the state. The government didn't even acknowledge the existence of these files. To a large extent, through the work of a man named Dennis Töllborg, was the truth about these political blacklistings made public, and registered people would at last be informed they had been in these files. The most controversial of all the leaders of the Social Democrat Party was Olof Palme. Even though he was born into an upper-class family, something that aroused suspicion in the Workers' Party, he was still eventually able to become its leader in 1969. Much of his legacy is defined by his opposition to the USA. He was an outspoken opponent both of the Vietnam War and the capitalistic system. He is credited with saying that it was from watching American society that he became a socialist. Much of his political career would consist of picking fights with the USA. These fights started in 1965 when he held his first speech criticizing the USA over the Vietnam War. At that time he was only a minister in the government. He would further anger the USA by marching against the war on the 21st of February 1968 with representatives of the North Vietnamese government. In a speech he held during that demonstration, he said this: "But if you're going to talk about democracy in Vietnam, it's obvious that it's represented to a greater extent by the Viet Cong than by the United States and its allied juntas."